Welcome to session 296 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 23rd of October. Today we'll be looking at Romans 11 to 12 and Psalm 118. But so far in Romans, we've read through the section on how the gospel is good news for both Jew and Gentile, and how the gospel creates new humanity. We looked at how Paul was writing to a church of both Jews and Gentiles drawn into a culture war. And we saw that from the beginning of the letter, Paul wanted to address this. Paul began his letter by emphasizing his calling to share the gospel. This gospel is rooted in its Jewish heritage, but is meant for all humanity, both Jew and Gentile. He explained that all humanity is trapped in sin, including the Jews. Their special relationship with God carried responsibility, not special privileges. The solution is faith in Jesus, who frees people from sin. Paul highlighted Abraham, who was saved by faith before the law. He serves as a father of all believers, making all who have faith in Jesus part of one family. Paul then explained how the gospel creates a new humanity where believers are justified through Jesus and made right with God. We rejoice in suffering as it shapes us to be more like Jesus. While Adam's sin brought death and sin, Jesus' death and resurrection bring life, forming a new humanity through grace. This new humanity is embraced through baptism. Baptism symbolizes dying to the old self and rising to new life in Christ. Paul then clarified that freedom in Christ doesn't mean we can live in sin, as sin enslaves us. Instead, offering our lives to God brings true freedom and life. Though the law was meant to guide against sin, sin used it to trap people. But through Jesus, believers are no longer condemned. We're no longer accountable to the law, but to the Spirit. Paul described his struggle with the power of sin in his life, but reassured us that the Spirit empowers believers to live in freedom. By following the Spirit, not sin, believers are made children of God and heirs of his promise. And although the struggle with sin continues, it is nothing compared to the future hope when all creation will be fully transformed by the Spirit. Meanwhile, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ. What then do we do with the Jews who have rejected Jesus? What about God's promises to them? Paul answered this by pointing out that throughout Jewish and Israelite history, there are those who were born descendants of Abraham that didn't participate in the promises to Abraham, descendants of the flesh versus descendants of the promise. The fact that some Jews have rejected Jesus was part of what allowed Gentiles to become descendants of the promise, while not being descendants of the flesh. In short, these Jews have opted out of the promise by rejecting Jesus. To opt back in, all they need to do is accept him. But for now, let's jump in with today's reading, Romans 11 to 12. Going back to an earlier question, has God rejected the Israelites? Paul's answer is no. He is an Israelite. Paul references 1 Kings 19 verses 10 to 18, pointing out that we saw Elijah encouraging God to reject the Israelites for their disobedience. God responded, saying that he'd reserved for himself 7,000 Israelites who are still obedient. So as we've said, God continues to choose a remnant, a select group from the wider group that are faithful and will continue to be descendants of the promise. And again, this is due to God's goodness and grace, not because of the group's righteousness. The rest were hardened as part of God's plan to include the Gentiles. At this, Paul then looks forward to the future of Israel. It is his hope that the inclusion of the Gentiles will make the Jews jealous. Hopefully, from that place of jealousy, they will find their way back. If the initial rejection of the Jews led Gentiles to being included in the promise, what incredible benefit will their eventual acceptance of Jesus look like? Paul explains that part of the reason he is an apostle to the Gentiles is to spur his people into jealousy. Again, this hope is that if some Jews were worthy enough to receive God's grace through Jesus, then eventually all will. But if it's the case that these branches of Jews have been fully broken off, and the Gentiles have been grafted in their place, then the Gentiles should not boast. It is the heritage of the Jews, the patriarchs, the prophets, the scriptures, that the Gentiles are being grafted into. And remember, it wasn't because of their righteousness that the Gentiles were included, but because of God's goodness. If he was more than willing to break off the original branches for their pride, then God will be just as willing to break off the new branches if they are similarly proud. And in the same way, if God was willing to graft in these wild branches, the Gentile branches, then there's always a chance he will graft back in the original branches. This then leads us to perhaps the most controversial passage in the whole New Testament, Romans 11 verses 25 to 36. He again asserts that some of the Jews, Israelites, have been hardened to allow Gentiles in, and will continue to be hardened until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. That's Romans 11 verse 25. And at that point, all Israel will be saved. That's Romans 11 verse 26. It's unclear exactly what each phrase means. Is there a specific number of Gentiles that need to be saved, and then when that time comes, we're done? Is Paul referring to the mission to the Gentiles, as in when the gospel has been spread to the ends of the earth, so all have had their opportunity to be saved? And what is meant by all Israel? Is it like the previous verse, in that all the Israelites that have chosen Jesus? Or does it mean literally every single Israelite individual? Or is it some combination of Jew and Gentile that makes a new spiritual Israel that is saved? Scholars are very divided on these interpretations. Even as Paul points out, these Jews are both enemies of God because they've rejected the gospel, but beloved by God because of the special relationship they have with him as descendants of Israel. God shows mercy to the disobedient, and so there's still an opportunity for God to show mercy to these Jews, even though they've rejected Jesus. Paul was clearly right when he called this a mystery. Well, I'm sure there are plenty of people who have very strong opinions on this passage on what it all means. I believe there is a clear lesson that the majority of us can learn from Paul's talk about the Jews. As we saw in Romans 9 verses 2 to 3, Paul has a deep compassion for the Jews, and it is his desire that all Jews are eventually saved. That should also be our desire, that all, Jew and Gentile, all are saved. And if there's some spiritual loophole that means that all Jews will one day be saved, we should celebrate it, not begrudge it. Not saying there is, but if there is. Because more people being saved, however it is done, is a win to be celebrated. Clearly recognizing the confusing nature of what he has just described, Paul ends this section with a doxology, a closing prayer, thanking God for his mysterious ways. We cannot fully know them or understand them. Not only does this doxology close out this section on the place of the Jews in light of the gospel, it also closes out the book so far. Up until now, Paul has been explaining the theology of the gospel. Next up, he's going to unpack what the gospel should then look like in practice in our lives and in the lives of the Roman Church. Paul appeals to his reader based on the mercies of God, which he unpacked in Romans 1 to 11, to offer their bodies as a living sacrifice and be transformed by the renewing of their minds. In other words, the gospel should lead to believers living their lives for God and allowing themselves to be transformed in line with God's will. In a community of believers, this looks like parts of a body working together. No one part is more important than the other. But when each part does its role well, the whole body is blessed. Paul then lists some examples of what an individual's role might be: prophesying, ministering, teaching, exhorting / encouraging, leading and being compassionate. This list isn't to be seen as comprehensive. It's seen as a gift from God through us to the rest of the believers. Paul encourages believers to show genuine love and support for one another, living peacefully and overcoming evil with good. He highlights the importance of serving others, showing hospitality, and refraining from seeking revenge. Up until this point, we've read through Paul's theology of the gospel that declares us new humans that make up one family, empowered by the Spirit to live free from the power of sin, to indulge the Spirit and not sin in our lives. In practice, that looks like these things. Paul is highlighting the way that we avoid indulging sin and instead indulge the Spirit in a way that protects the unity of the family that we are now part of. But that's Romans 11 to 12. Now let's look at Psalm 136. This psalm isn't attributed to anyone in particular and falls into the category of praise psalm. Every verse ends with the phrase, "For his steadfast love endures forever." Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verses 1 to 3, a call to give thanks to the Lord. Verses 4 to 9, he is Lord over all creation. Verses 10 to 22, he delivered his people from Egypt and into their own land. And then verses 23 to 26, he remembers, rescues, and provides. The psalmist opens with a call to give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. Give thanks to him, for he is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. He is greater than any other. Then the psalmist focuses on the Lord as creator. He alone does great wonders. Through his understanding, the heavens, earth, and seas were made. The sun, moon, and stars were all made by him. Next up is the Exodus, where God brought the people out of Egypt. He struck the firstborn of Egypt and brought out his people. With his strength and mercy, he split the Red Sea in two and caused his people to walk through it, but drowned Pharaoh and his armies. He led his people through the wilderness, defeating great nations before them so they might inherit the land. And finally, the psalmist highlights that God is the one who remembers, who rescues, and who provides. He remembered his people, rescuing them from their foes and giving them food. And so the psalmist gives a final call to give thanks to the God of heaven. Through it all, every characteristic or action of God is attributed to his steadfast love that endures forever. Everything God is and does flows out of his love, and we can be confident in that always. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.